Okay, welcome everyone. Today's webinar is the RESCON Care Committee's Best Practice Guide launch. And so this is a very exciting day, and it's the culmination of a lot of work by a lot of committees and a lot of individuals. As you know, DE&I touches all aspects of your business, whether it's labor relations, health and safety, labor supply, and essentially just good governance. And so as a result, this guide that we're going to launch today was reviewed by the Board of Directors, the Health and Safety Committee, the Training and Education Committee, as well as other members of the RESCON Care Roundtable, construction stakeholders, legal counsel. As you can tell, we went out to a very wide network because the opinion and the thoughts of everyone really matter. And so we wanted to make sure that we had representation from kind of all areas of expertise, but also from a diverse group of individuals. I also specifically want to thank the RESCON Care Committee and two, I guess, former employees now, but both Amina Dib and Ahed Al-Lashri both did considerable work on this, and their work needs to be recognized. So as we've said, and as everybody knows, the RESCON Care Committee has representatives from the builders, from the sub-trades, from labor, from management. It has government stakeholders involved. It has other stakeholders from the industry, and it's a group that comes together to really work on DEI issues within the construction industry. Some of our areas of focus are policies and procedures. Today, it's focusing on the best practice guide launch. We're also today really going to focus on implementation. And the idea is because DE&I touches so many parts of your business, we want to focus on the areas of your business where DEI and focusing on it can make improvements, but we also want to focus on areas where it creates liabilities and how we can mitigate them. And so that's what our speakers are going to get into. And so today we're going to hear from Minister Williams. We're going to hear from Joel Moody, who's the CPO. We're going to do a bit of a coffee chat with a woman that everybody knows named Kathy Martin. And we're going to have a legal presentation from Diane Laranja. And Meredith is going to actually walk us through a little bit and highlight some of the key parts to the best practice guide. I'd also like to bring attention to the TCBN. They're going to have an event in June, and there's nominations for people who are kind of outstanding in this field, and the last day for nominations is today. And so during the presentation, we'll get that link in the chat if you'd like to nominate anybody. As always, please put your questions in the question and answer feature, or use the chat and we'll get the questions to the speakers. In addition, anyone who's registered will get a copy of this webinar, and we do make everything available. And so with that, I would like to do a quick land acknowledgement. And so we respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nation, Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nation. As RESCON's office is located in Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. And now I think I get to turn it over to Meredith, who is going to introduce a video from the minister.
So our first keynote speaker today is Charmaine Williams, who is the Associate Minister of Women's Social and Economic Opportunity. Minister Williams has spearheaded numerous economic, social, and cultural initiatives for the Brampton community. And we thank Minister Williams for sending a video over today. So I'm just going to share that.
Hi everyone, I'm Charmaine Williams, Ontario's Associate Minister of Women's Social and Economic Opportunities. I'd like to thank Richard Lyle and Andrew Perzer and RESCON for giving me the opportunity to share my greetings with you today. I'd also like to thank everyone participating in today's webinar for their commitment to increasing diversity and inclusion in the residential construction industry. As you know, Ontario has made a commitment to build at least 1.5 million homes by 2031. To build the homes and the communities of the future, Ontario will need thousands of additional construction workers over the coming years. And under the leadership of Premier Ford, our government is investing millions through the Skills Development Fund, the Women's Economic Security Program, and the Investing in Women's Futures Program to encourage and train more women in the skills trades. And with our legislative changes, like ensuring we have proper PPE and access to clean washrooms, we are making these jobs more welcoming and accessible for women. And this is essential to our province reaching our goal of building the homes that Ontarians need. Now, today's webinar and the RESCON Care Committee Best Practice Guide are examples of the initiatives taking place across the province to pave the way for more women to enter careers in construction and the trades. So once again, thank you for your commitment to building more welcoming and inclusive workplaces. And I wish all of you an informative discussion today. Together, I know we can create a province full of opportunity for women and girls, because when women succeed, Ontario succeeds.
Great, and we do want to thank the minister for sending that video and participating. We've had the opportunity, obviously, to work with her very closely, and this is an issue that's near and dear to her heart, and she continues to provide incredible leadership on the issue. We'd like to introduce our next keynote, Dr. Joel Moody. So we'll get him here up on the screen. Now, he is a fan favorite and doesn't really need an introduction, but we'll give him a short one. So, Dr. Moody, has it been 3 years now that you've been the CPO, or 2?
2.5.
2.5. Okay, so we'll put it right in the middle there. In that short time, we like to think as Dr. Joel Moody, who's the Chief Prevention Officer, as that steady hand on the tiller. And so when it comes to health and safety, when it comes to prevention, when it comes to doing better and figuring out what are the important things we need to do connected to health and safety to prevent injuries from occurring, this is the guy you call. So I'm pretty much calling him every week at this point. But we're always happy to have him. That'll be my brief introduction, and I'll turn it over to him because he's a much better speaker than I am. So.
Well, Andrew, thank you as always, and RESCON for having me join all of you today to really talk about how we continue on our journey of growth and progress, not just for businesses, but what about our communities, our employees, and ourselves? So today, I encourage you to take those next steps in our collective journey towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, why should we even care about EDI in the workplaces? It's more than just a buzzword, checkbox, you got to complete it on the form. It's about fostering that environment where we know every individual, they feel valued, respected, empowered, bringing their whole selves to the workplace. It's also about recognizing the diverse perspectives, because that leads to innovation, better outcomes, all of those things that I know we want to achieve. And it's about doing what's right, not just because the laws, the legislations, the regulations, they require it, but it's because it's the moral imperative that we should do. So let's, begin, we acknowledge that there is tons of legislations that exist in Ontario. We have a very robust place that protects the rights of workers and promotes equity in the workplace. Employment Standards Act, the Ontario Labor Relations Act, Human Rights Code, Occupational Health and Safety Act. So we have that framework that outlines the employer's obligations. But as I said before, compliance should not be our only goal. That's the baseline where we want to be exceeding and striving to exceed. So when we talk about EDI in the context of health and safety, we're just not talking about physical safety, remember. Although that's crucial, we're also talking about psychological safety, creating an environment where employees feel safe to speak, share their ideas, challenge the status quo without any fear of reprisals. Because we know, and the studies are very clear, that when you have diverse teams, they are more likely to identify and mitigate risk, effectively leading to those safer workplaces that I know we can do. But what about from a business perspective, in addition to health and safety, recruitment, retention, very important components as well. So by embracing diversity within the hiring practices, you're not just going to attract your top talent, and this is going to come from all walks of life, but it also reflects the communities that you build in, the communities that you're drawing your talent from. So recruitment is step one, but retention. And that's where your real work is going to continue to work. So how do we create that environment that allows and you want your staff to stay with you? Because they may feel supported, they feel valued, and they're given equal opportunities to grow and advance. Would be remiss if I didn't talk about mentorship. That was another very important aspect when we talk about growth. because it's by providing these opportunities of mentorship to employees from underrepresented populations, marginalized groups, that we not only help navigate the complexities of the workplace, but you're investing in your future leaders. And they're the ones that are going to drive your organization forward in a positive direction. So remember, mentorship is not just about imparting knowledge, but it's about fostering relationships that are built on trust, empathy, and mutual respect. I know some of you are probably thinking, where do we start? Seems great. I like all these words you're saying, Dr. Moody, but it may seem daunting. And yes, change can be a challenge, but it's not impossible. Start by educating ourselves, our teams, fostering those open and honest conversations about diversity and inclusion, and committing to continuous improvement. We can also leverage resources such as, RESCON's best practice guide, and the support within your networks, your communities and industries who've done this before, and they have walked the path. So in conclusion, just want to say thank you once again, Andrew and RESCON, for allowing me just to come and talk with you a little bit, because it's about embracing diversity and inclusion. Remember, it's just not the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Creating those workplaces where everyone has equal opportunity to thrive, contribute, and be successful. So let's take those steps together. We're going to hear some great dialogue and discussion from the other panelists today, because I know that it's not only our collective efforts that will help us move forward, because it's through those collective efforts they will benefit businesses and the world that we live in. So thank you very much for some time to talk with you. Andrew?
Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time. And I think even more than that, kind of what you said at the end, good things happen when labor management and the government come together. And you're a big part of that, and we really appreciate it. And I think there's not always a right answer, there's not always a wrong answer. And I think trying to figure out some of that stuff and the things that we can do together really make a difference. And I think what you said today hopefully will give people what they need to really take the next step forward when they go back to their company and want to push either to make additional improvements in their DEI journey or just to get started. So thank you very much for that. So always appreciate it. So we're now going to, I guess, officially launch the DEI guide. And so Meredith is going to take over and she's going to present it. So let's hear from Meredith now.
Just want to make sure you guys can see my screen
Yeah, we can.
before I start. Perfect. So this is just going to be a high-level introduction to what the best practice guide is. In no way is it going in depth into it, but later we will share this in the post-event summary and everyone can take a better look at it. So what is the CARE Committee? The Construction Against Racism Everywhere Committee was launched to bring employers, unions, and governments together to address racism in the construction industry, with the main goal of fostering a welcoming and inclusive construction site that embraces diversity in all of its forms. The CARE Committee is committed to creating the resources and pathways to help the residential industry recruit, retain, and empower individuals from various backgrounds. Looking forward, we will continue to engage with our CARE Committee and also continue to host events promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the construction industry. So next, we're going to get into the goals of the CARE Committee. So the CARE Committee's goals include engagement and advocacy, the development of best practices and policies, communication and leadership, and complementing the efforts of those already working on DE&I initiatives. So engagement and advocacy focuses on fostering an active engagement with industry stakeholders to promote inclusivity, advocate for diversity and equity, driving positive change within the construction sector, the development of best practices, which this is our best practice guide. So formulating the comprehensive guidelines and policies to establish industry leading standards, cultivating an environment that encourages adherence to best practices for diversity and inclusion, and then communication in the leadership, promoting leadership initiatives that inspire positive cultural shifts within the construction industry. Lastly, complementing the efforts of those already working on DE&I initiatives. This centers around working towards a shared goal. So researching best practices that other industries have already had success with was a great help when launching our best practice guide. Then moving on, our target audience. In no way does this include everyone, just because this guide does impact everyone. So on here, we've just mentioned some of the people that we're hoping to target. So that includes DE&I cultural representatives, on-site labor and leadership, HR and management, health and safety reps, as well as joint labor management committees, external stakeholders, and labor unions. DE&I and anti-racism is an ongoing process, and this should be implemented as a team. This is a team effort, and it should not just be done by one individual at a company. Moving on to the purpose of the guide. The guide aims to be an introduction to your business's approach to anti-racism and DE&I. This guide provides the construction industry with resources as well as making them more actionable. So this document is designed with the following goals. One, to meet you where you are at as a builder, to create awareness on how DE&I impacts your business, to enhance your ability to recruit, train, and retain good talent, to eliminate or minimize the risk of health and safety issues, grievances, or other related issues, and to proactively address and eliminate your risk in your business on construction sites. So moving forward, we have the structure of the best practice guide. So we have the significance, we have under that falls legal compliance, business benefits. Then we have understanding positive workplace culture, implementation strategies, and resources. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive, but again, this does not include everything. So for legal compliance, the Ontario Human Rights Code and Occupational Health and Safety Act outline the legal responsibilities of employers to protect workers from instances of racism within the workplace. Each employer in Ontario is obligated to craft and review policy addressing workplace violence and harassment. And later on in this webinar, we will hear from Diane, who will give us a deeper dive into what the employer's legal compliance is and highlight the importance for employers to establish a workplace free from discrimination. Moving on to business benefits. This includes increased motivation and productivity, which looks like engaged employees are more motivated and productive, driving business growth and success. Higher retention rates. An inclusive workplace promotes loyalty and commitment among employees, ultimately reducing turnover rates. And lastly, enhanced communication and collaboration. A positive work culture promotes open communication and facilitates more collaboration amongst its employees. Understanding a positive workplace culture and defining the basics of what that looks like. A positive company culture is an attitude and environment within an organization that cultivates collaboration, productivity, and satisfaction amongst its employees. There are many factors that can affect culture on site, such as management attitudes. The behaviors of management set the tone for the whole work environment. Shared beliefs and values, shared ideas, mutual respect, and inclusion ultimately strengthens the team. Accountability, holding people accountable for their actions, promotes transparency and trust. Employee recognition, acknowledging the achievements of individuals. That's not just senior leadership, that's everybody on the ground as well. Onboarding practices, ensuring that onboarding incorporates mutual respect and teaches new employees about the positive working culture. For implementation strategies, facilitating open communication spaces, establishing an environment where open communication is present is essential in fostering a positive culture on site. This can be implemented through regular check-ins where managers or superintendents allow employees the space to share their thoughts and feedback. as well as implementing confidential feedback systems. This is a great way to allow employees to express their concerns without the fear of retribution. Addressing contentious topics. Given the diverse workforce on construction sites, addressing sensitive topics, including diversity and inclusion, is imperative. Organizing toolbox talks on diversity or providing training on cultural sensitivity are great ways to promote a cohesive and inclusive environment on site. For cultivating conflict resolution skills, providing training programs centered around conflict resolution is a great way to support employees navigating disagreements professionally and collaboratively. Creating buy-in focuses on more of a positive reinforcement approach. This avoids negative approaches and focuses more on strategic messaging and including the positive working culture when speaking to employees. And then lastly, the tips for an effective toolbox talk. Identify similarities. So this looks like focus on conversations that center on similarities and shared hobbies. This creates a shared network and helps promote shared goals amongst the workforce. Then acknowledging significant occasions throughout workplace lunches, coffee breaks, email blasts, or toolbox talks creates an atmosphere of respect for each other's traditions. When conducting a toolbox talk, focus on relevance, timing, choosing an engaging speaker, using concise messaging, and offering small incentives like coffee to help create a positive workplace or positive atmosphere for the talk. It is important to ensure employees have the space to ask questions and share their ideas. And lastly, it's always important to keep record of what topics were covered in these talks and when they were conducted. Lastly, we will include resources and different tools on the best practice guide. These are being offered from BuildForce, IHSA, and CAC. So those will be different links for you to check out and some different courses that you may be interested in. Thank you.
I guess we do have some time for questions. So if people want to use either the chat or the Q&A feature, that would be great. I guess the first question that came in, Meredith, for you is how does a builder or a sub-trade or employer use this? Do they print it out and just include it with their HR material and in their on-site trailer? Or is it more like some of the guys we've done in the past where you use it to kind of build it out on your own?
So this is definitely just a guideline on just to support you moving forward in your DE&I journey. This isn't necessarily something to have posted in the site trailer, but it will help you develop your own policies moving forward.
Perfect. And then as far as first steps, lots of employers will recognize birthdays or they'll specialize or they'll celebrate special occasions. Is that a way to kind of get a start?
I think for sure different like celebrating birthdays as well as maybe different cultural occasions such as Eid, doing something for those people on site and just making it known that they're acknowledging that day would definitely be a first step.
Mm-hmm. And please ask more questions. I don't have any others, but there is time for that. I think one of the things that we heard as we did consultation on this guide was to really focus on what connects people at construction, and instead of necessarily trying to focus on what divides us. And so to pick up on what Meredith said, focusing on what brings people together and what the similarities are, and even creating education events around special holidays and things like that, that really can have a uniting force. And we heard that several times before. We will give, another minute or two here for any last questions. I don't know if you got any final thoughts there, Meredith.
No, I think it will be interesting to see what people have to say about the best practice guide, and we're always open to communicate with everyone if you have some questions about how to get started or maybe where you're at in this journey. Me and Andrew are definitely open to talk to you later on.
Okay, and actually one just came in. So helpful tip, during Ramadan, try not to schedule team lunches as a way to be respectful, considerate of those of faith. Yeah, so that is a big one for anybody who's fasting. That needs to be considered. And then another question, what influence, if any, would the unions have on this initiative? So maybe I'll take that one, Meredith.
Yeah.
So the unions are part of the RESCON Care Committee. During the last round of bargaining, we did insert language specifically right into the collective agreement. Also, every union that we work with, especially the laborers, they've created their own, I want to say campaigns or their own committees related to this as well. And so I think we got into this, and by we, I mean RESCON got into this largely in 2020 with some of the incidents that happened on site. And so for some of the stuff, we've all come together and worked together, but I think every individual has also taken the challenge individually. And so I would encourage you to go on to the different unions' websites. And find out specifically what they're doing, but certainly 183, the Carpenters, some of the other groups that we've partnered with have certainly invested considerable resources into these initiatives as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, and with that, I think we did say that this will go up on the RESCON website. It's going to be emailed out to everybody here after the webinar, but thank you very much for that presentation, Meredith. Okay, and moving along. So I have the opportunity, and I'm going to add her, to introduce Kathy Martin. And so this is a bit of what I'll call a coffee chat. And so Kathy is no stranger to RESCON or to the RESCON webinars. I think her title officially has to do with mental health, but anybody knows Kathy knows she does a lot more than that. You work kind of in the stakeholder department, you're the mental health expert, but you've also got a niche within DEI, and you've become a real spokesperson for the IHSA on some of these issues. And so we try to listen to all the RESCON members and all the participants of all these webinars, and oftentimes we get comments like, I want to hear more about IHSA and some of the services they provide, and so certainly this is an opportunity for that. And so it was a short introduction, but I think that's mainly because my first question is going to kind of build on that. And so Kathy and I are going to have what I call a bit of a coffee chat. And so if there are questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm going to just use a couple questions that I've written down, and Kathy and I are really just going to have a chat. And so the first question that I've got for you, Kathy, is how did you get into construction? Kind of tell us your story a bit.
Thanks. And you're the first person to actually frame it that way. How did I get into construction? And, I kind of chuckle because I guess I haven't really thought of it in that way. I guess I am working in construction. But I'll just give you a little context, who I am and how I came to be at IHSA. So I've been in the business here of talking about workplace mental health for, I hate to age myself here, but probably the better of 30 years now, 30 plus. So I worked for many years working for the Canadian Mental Health Association, long before workplaces really even were talking about workplace mental health. And through that work, I was the national program manager of a program called Mental Health Works, and it's still actually a program of the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division. And through that program, I worked collaboratively with the CMHA national office, and we worked to really bring forward the need to start talking about these issues, similar to what we're doing here today, the need to talk about D&I in our workplaces. We needed to kind of start the conversation around mental health in the workplaces. And jump forward a few years, I was instrumental in helping to sort of bring about the need for national standards here in Canada. So around psychological health and safety, we heard Dr. Moody mention about the need for having environments that are psychologically safe so that people can stand up and speak out and be themselves. So helped in drafting that first standard for Canada in psychological health and safety, and then kind of got a little tired of talking at employers and wanted to work with a few employers to kind of really get a feel for what it's like to be an employer tackling some of these issues, because it's easy for somebody to say, do this, do that, right? It's another thing to actually do it. So I want people on the line to know I've actually gone the other route. I've actually worked with employers and helping them do this. So the one employer that I began with was just a small company called University Health Network here in Toronto area. And if you're not familiar, that's Princess Margaret, which I'm sure many of you are. Princess Margaret, Toronto General, Toronto Western, and a few other organizations. So they had a small staff of 30,000 that they needed to look at their employee wellness and including their mental well-being. So just a small task. Enjoyed that work immensely. And then I had a real passion in trauma and critical incident response. So, people used to call me the trauma mama. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, Andrew. But so I went off and I worked for TD Bank. I really wanted to I worked on a contract helping them look at their trauma response program and how they responded to things that happen on the job. And coincidentally, banks get robbed like once a day across Canada. Who knew, right? So they face a lot of trauma, and they wanted to be able to have the supports in place to deal not only with investigations and incidences, but how do we support our employees through that? So that was a big piece of what I did. And then the opportunity with IHSA came up, and it was kind of ironic. My contract with TD Bank ended right before the pandemic, so I had a nice little break and holiday over the pandemic year, and then came back to IHSA in 2021. And I'm so happy to be able to take everything I've learned over the years and really zone in and work with not just an employer and not kind of that global speak, but really get into like the unique niche issues that are facing a sector like construction. And IHSA obviously serves other trades like transportation and utility sectors as well. So be able to take all of that broader general knowledge and really hone into some of these really unique challenges that we face. And then through that, looking broadly speaking at culture, culture is a really significant piece. And this guide that you've just launched, I have to say, really kind of solidifies a lot of the things that I've been speaking about over the years. It really kind of brings it all into sort of one guiding document, which I love. So thank you. Thank you for doing that. So that's just a little bit more about me and how I came to be here.
Yeah, and I think, well, thank you for the comments that you've made. I think when we wanted you to introduce yourself, because I think you've built a career, one on kind of solving problems, but also kind of caring for people and essentially helping other groups, whether it's employers or other groups, figure out ways to actually care and help out their employers. It's a bit inspiring, but you've got both sides to it. So you've got the resources when something bad happens, but then you've also got the resources and the education on kind of what you can do before something bad happens. And so
Absolutely. Yeah.
to have leading questions, can you talk to us about some of the resources that you've been able to develop and IHSA has been developed kind of on both sides? Like, this is what you do before an incident happens, and this is what you do, God forbid, an incident does happen.
Yeah. So, since my time at IHSA, which is now just, I can't believe it, rounding 3 years now, done lots of different things for them to kind of build a framework, if you will, for I'd say to be able to start to speak on these topics because it was kind of a void for them prior to me coming on. So some of the things I've been doing is building out some base toolkits just to get some general knowledge out there. So we have an employer toolkit online, which really dovetails quite nicely with this guide that you've put out. Looking at how do we develop a strategy around some of these complex issues like mental health, substance use health, and D&I is a big piece of that as well. So how do we build strategy? And so that's there, but also, resource toolkits for the worker, right? I might be struggling. My employer doesn't do anything for me. I don't know where to go. Maybe they'll stumble across the toolkit that we have for workers. But one thing I really like, and it's that care piece that you just mentioned, is the supporter toolkit that we have online that I built out. And again, in my early days, I just kind of grabbed the tools and resources that were already out there, bring them all together, say, here, here's some things to get you started. Kind of did some of the concierge for people, so they didn't have to go running around to all sorts of other sectors to find information, give something to our sector. But then taking some of that and really having conversations, starting to have conversation with the industry. So I've developed in partnership with IHSA's marketing team, some podcasts. So if you want to listen to me speak and chat some more, there's lots you can listen to on the way home or today or, later throughout the week. But there's some podcasts there that kind of go through different topics related to mental health. So how do you recognize when someone might be struggling? But one of the things too that I've done is to your earlier point, how do I build a program or in place to sort of make sure that I'm not missing the boat or I'm not forgetting how to support someone when tragedy does happen, right? So getting prepared, getting a little more further upstream to have a plan in place. So when something does happen in the workplace, something traumatic, and we know in construction in particular, accidents happen and sometimes they're very traumatic. And so we want to be able to not just investigate, we want to be able to investigate, of course, but support the workers who've been exposed to trauma and also support our investigation teams. They get exposed to an awful lot. So those are a couple of things we do. Of course, safety talks, and we have a facilitator guide. And yeah, just I could go on.
No, and that's good. And I think something that Dr. Moody touched upon and that you touched upon is a real focus on emotional safety and psychological safety. And like you've had a good career, and maybe even just if you can talk as you're talking about this, kind of the evolution of it. I sit on a bunch of WSIB committees, and I'll call it industry talk, but 20, 30 years ago, when somebody got injured, to figure out compensation, it wasn't a nice title, but they used to call it a meat chart because everything was based
Yeah.
on physical injuries. And certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen more and more recognition of psychological injuries, but we've seemed to focus more on emotional and psychological safety as well. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about those issues and really how they've evolved over the last 30 years.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you know, what got me interested actually in this career actually was I was working with individuals who had a whole host of different types of challenges or what we would call disabilities, and so be it mental health or physical health, just challenges or disabilities, trying to reintegrate them back into the workplace after they've been off for a period of time trying to heal. So it could have been a year gap. For some it was like 5 years off. How to get them back into the workplace. I was really tired of dropping them into workplaces and seeing them back on my door within the 3-month window. Like they were just getting let go because the employers had no clue how to deal with any of these issues, right? They had no idea. Like it's like, if you're not 100%, I don't want to deal with you. And so we had that catch and release mindset, I think for many, many years. We just didn't, as employers, just didn't want to deal with the problems. So that led me to want to work with employers and say, hey, we can do better. And that's where a lot of my work with CMHA was like, well, what is the conversation? And, of course, psychological health and safety and the CSA standard is about what are those things that employers can do, obviously, to mitigate some of the risks, right? Look at those hazards that we know based on the research are causing people psychological harm, right? And years ago, I think the conversation was really centered around first responders in particular, kind of recognizing that they were developing a lot of post-traumatic stress, right? We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, and they were going off work. And there wasn't really that mechanism to recognize that they're being injured on the job because of the job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we support them? How do we, not just financially through WSAB and some of those legislation changes, but how do workplaces support workers through that? So that was where I kind of really got
Mm-hmm.
kind of into that trauma piece, right? Like looking at how do we support frontline workers, and worked with different police organizations across the country and got involved with an organization called Tema Conter Memorial Trust, which was all first responder based. So it has been an evolving conversation, and leading into sort of more corporate world, kind of definitely was one of the earlier adopters. And if you're corporate employer out there, I apologize for saying this, but it was a bit easier. Some of the challenges weren't as difficult, I think, as some of the challenges that we see definitely in construction.
But I think that's important. I don't think we have to hide behind that, right? And
no,
so
no, no.
construction has a lot of small businesses, it has a lot of family businesses.
Yeah,
In some way, construction is a leader. Well, in many ways, construction is a leader. In many ways, construction is a leader in health and safety. I'm not
absolutely.
sure that when you look across the landscape, construction has got the leadership position on this one. And I think one of our goals for this best practice guide was to kind of recognize that and say, okay, let's meet you where you're at.
Mhm.
And you know, we can't, so I think there's a phrase, I'm gonna butcher it, but essentially, you know, the best time to start something was like 10 years ago, but the second best time is tomorrow or today, right? And so we're gonna kind of do the latter part. Not
Absolutely.
to change the conversation, but another question is, so let's say there's an employer sitting there right now and they say, well, I really haven't done much on this, or maybe I feel like I should do more. How can an employer get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's a few things that the employer can do to get started. One will be to read RESCON's guide. And the reason I'll say that is because, well, there's a couple things. I'll finish my thought first. So
Mhm.
there's RESCON's guide. There is, if you've not ever looked at it, download the Psychological Health and Safety Standard from the Canadian Standards Association, CSA, because it's free. First off, and it's an interesting read, I like to think. Anyways, um, we need to build this into our DNA, into the fabric of what we do. And a lot of folks in the construction industry, they're already assessing hazards, right? That's what we do. If you've bought into the health and safety conversation, which I know has been driving over the years, hopefully you have a health and safety management system like CORE or maybe an ISO standard. Look at the psychological health and safety standard as something to complement or to integrate within your existing health and safety system. It shouldn't be separate. This isn't all, fluff and nice to do. So there's some concrete, tangible things I think the standard will give to employers. But the second is to recognize, and this is where your guide is so instrumental and comes in place, is we have to recognize that you can have the best system, policies, programs in place. And there is a cliche, and I might butcher it too, but they say, culture eats strategy, right? For preface, right? If we don't have the culture within our workplace, it doesn't matter what policies and programs you have in place, they're not going to be as effective as if you
Mhm.
have that positive, healthy workplace culture. And so obviously the psychological standard is helping to drive that culture piece by
Mhm.
doing certain things, but attitude, right? And education and understanding and bias, checking in with personal bias, all that goes into the culture, right? So
Yeah.
we do need to make culture shift, not only in construction, but I think across our society in
So
general.
let's dive in there because culture is an important word, and we talk about the culture of safety and continuous improvement and all that great stuff. So, to make it really practical, let's get right down to the ground level. So, somebody's sitting there saying, okay, we don't measure the culture because I'm a little bit worried about what I'm going to find, right? And
Yep.
so, if somebody says, okay, how do I properly, or maybe not properly, but how do I get a real read on what my culture is? So how do I figure out what my culture is instead of guessing what my culture is? And then second, once I figure out what my culture is, how do I start building a better one?
Yeah. Like I hate to say it, but to understand something, you do kind of have to measure it, right? So, I think there's some audit tools out there that if you don't want to go right out and do like an employee survey, there are some tools you can do to sort of audit, where am I at? So if you think of like a core audit, you're not running out
Mhm.
to the employee, interviewing, that's you, right? As a health and safety person, or as a leader of a smaller business, checking off the box to see, do I have these things? And there's certain things that you need to have in place to be able to look at these issues more holistically. Um, and and so, like I said, IHSA does have that employer toolkit, which kind of helps build those building blocks. But if, let's say, you've measured and you don't know what to do with that, or let's say you don't want to do that, you don't want to audit, you just like, Kathy, tell me really, what do I need to do? And I think one of the first things you guys talked about is open communication, right? Having open dialogue. And that is fundamental. Doesn't matter what kind of human issue you're dealing with, you got to start talking about it. So I've been doing a lot of talk around opioids and opiate related harms and sort of the addiction space. And one of the things I often talk about is like creating a culture of support, ironically, and it all aligns with what you guys are doing. And what I talk about is, yeah, you got to talk openly. You got to talk openly about addiction recovery, mental health, diversity, inclusion. Like, how does diversity play into those conversations? Sometimes we don't think about diversity and how we're speaking about other things too. Like, I'll use mental health for an example.
Yeah.
There's many different cultures that view mental health differently, right? And we take often in our conversation with mental health from a very kind of Western white perspective. And I think Canadian Aboriginal communities definitely are trying to teach us more and more, and through the truth and reconciliation efforts, we're learning more and more that there's different ways to talk about many issues, and one in particular is mental health. But of course, diversity inclusion would be part of that conversation. So talk, but more importantly, Andrew, you and I are two white folks sitting here at the table. We need to listen, right? Because sometimes, it's the white folks that are doing the talking, and we need to sometimes learn when to stand back and listen. And part of that listening is through education, right? We need to know when to listen, and then when to take responsibility. So I'll just leave it at that. But there's
Yeah. And maybe as a follow-up, in construction, we're often outcome focused. And so we love to check boxes. We like to build things. There's a production schedule. We want to stay on top of it. Some of the learning that I've done, it seems like in this space, there needs to be a real focus on process. Because obviously, we can't, like, there is no box to check, and the journey and the process seems to be probably more important than the outcome, but certainly wanted to give you some space to talk about a focus on process.
Well, thanks, because I think the process is very similar to the process you do for other things, right? The plan, do, check, act, kind of cycle. It's really no different. We need to make a plan, right? And to set out a plan, this may sound a little daunting to folks maybe listening, but if we don't set a course to where we want to be in, 2 years, 1 year, or 5 years, 10 years out, we'll never get there, right? So we just have to stop and say, where are we now? Right? And that's part of that assessment. Where do we want to be and how are we going to get there? And there's some best practice guides like the RESCON's guide that's going to help lead you there. So plan. And that's one thing I say too, is like plan, and then execute the plan. Just take those steps, right? Take those small steps, test out the water, see how it's resonating, but be mindful of who should lead the plan, right? It's not necessarily, you need somebody to champion, obviously, and kind of make sure things get done, right? Or nothing gets done if you don't appoint leadership over the project. But it's about that engagement strategy. When we're talking about D&I, it's hugely important to be engaging everyone and making the conversation inclusive, right? And I think, like I said, as part of that is education, and a lot of listening, right? A lot of listening so that you can carefully craft a plan that is inclusive. And there's lots out there. And if you really don't know where to go, I can speak to and IHSA's behalf. We're newer at this ourselves. We're part of the construction industry. IHSA is looking at diversity and inclusion as an employer themselves, and we have a diversity inclusion committee like many organizations do, but we're looking at getting some expertise to the table, right? As much as Kathy knows things, Kathy's not formally trained as a D&I expert. I am actually now formally trained, but when we were starting the journey, I wasn't. And bringing in expertise is sometimes what you need to do. And I think bringing in, if you can't afford that, that's fine. Look at those best practice guides. They're well researched. The RESCON guides, gone through the rigor. You guys explain that, right? Lean in on what you're learning through those guides and test test out the waters, right? Don't be afraid.
And I think a lot of employers in construction are probably further ahead when it comes to like their mental health journey than necessarily their DI journey. I see the two very linked, and I know that you've done a lot of work on mental health, and so I didn't know if you wanted to talk about some of the linkages between the two.
Well, yeah, they're you can't have one with the other in my view. Like, so creating a psychologically healthy workplace, it's not just creating a psychological healthy workplace, you know, for the white guy, right?
Mhm.
It's creating a psychologically healthy workplace for all, right? And and when we don't, we're causing harm, right? And so when we don't take those diverse perspectives in consideration when we're dealing with mental health, then you're kind of missing the boat. You know, it's good
Mhm.
for some and not for others. So that's where I see it, one link. But if bullying and harassment, discrimination, and all of that's going on in a workplace, we know that's going to cause psychological harm to individuals, and those who are most often targeted by harassment and bullying are those from diverse communities, in particular, you know, the BIPOC community. So we we need to take that into consideration if we're seeing in our measuring, right? If we're seeing bullying and harassment, and we're not maybe seeing it coming through those reporting structures that we have in place, why? Why are we not seeing it? And it could come to the point that they don't feel psychologically safe to speak up. Joel
Mhm.
Moody talked about that, right? Dr. Joel talked about the fear of reprisal, right? To speak up. It's hard
Yeah,
when you
and
got a target on your back.
we had some builders who started kind of assessing their workplace culture, and what they found is when they did their first couple assessments, um, the willingness of individuals to come out and speak was fairly low. And then a
Mm,
year or two into the program, as you know, workers were able to decide, no, this is genuine, and this is a real, this is real. This is a real conversation.
a real
This is
effort.
authentic. They actually saw an increase in the number of complaints and the number of incidents reported. And so it's interesting because one would, potentially think more incidents means I'm doing worse, but I don't know if you want to kind of talk to the correlation there.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same when you start talking about mental health challenges and stuff. It's you start talking about it, and that's when you start seeing your employee assistance program numbers start to rise, right? Because people are feeling more comfortable and maybe less stigmatized to reach out for supports. We know that mental health is, you know, one of those things that's still pretty highly stigmatized,
Mhm.
especially unfortunately among men, that you know seeking help for our mental health challenges is difficult. So yeah, we see it in that regard, um, and it's okay. I think those are positive measures. They may seem, like you said, it depends how you look at it. I think I see those as positives, and people coming forward just to share with their managers and supervisors maybe of their mental health challenges and maybe the need for accommodation. Again, that's a positive.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, same. You want to see those numbers go up. That yeah, I'm being bullied, and you know, I'm not gonna. My workplace doesn't want this to happen, so I'm going to step forward and say it's happening. I
Mhm.
think that's a really good thing.
Perfect. And can't believe it, but our time's kind of flown by here. And so I always like whenever we do a conversation, is there one kind of point or one takeaway you'd love to leave with everybody, or you just want to say goodbye?
Well, you know, I think for me, again, you know, I come to this conversation as, you know, the middle-aged white woman here. So for me, if you relate to, you know, that position in life and that intersectionality, you know, you got to listen. You got to listen. And, you know, this is not a blame shame game for anyone. But we have a lot to learn, I think, from each other. And, you know, I'm always open to learning, even though I've been at this for a while, you know, I've got lots to learn. And, you know,
Absolutely. I think
yeah,
that's a great final thought. This is a really kind of fluid space, and we've seen a lot more investment and time spent on it since 2020, but I don't think anyone's got the one right answer. But
no, no.
I'll turn over to Merritt. I think she's going to properly thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that wonderful Q&A session. You definitely shared a great amount of resources, and it was wonderful to hear all the knowledge you have in that area.
Thank you.
So moving forward, we have Diane Laranja, who is a partner at Filion Wakely. Diane is a leading lawyer in labor, construction labor, and workplace human rights. We are very excited to have Diane here today to provide this legal presentation. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to her.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the RESCON team for inviting me to talk about this important topic. I also want to thank my colleague Naomi Santesteban, who's completing her articles and joining our team of lawyers shortly, and who skillfully helped put together the slides that we'll be using today. And as Andrew correctly notes, I'll be taking questions at the end of the seminar. So or at the end of this portion. So feel free to jot them in the chat or hang on to them to the end. Many of us remember this topic when it first came up, at least from the RESCON perspective in 2020. If we remember, we were in the midst of the pandemic, and we were also in the midst of significant racial tensions in the US and in Canada and across the world. And those tensions were difficult, long overdue, and certainly brought to the surface the beginnings of many important discussions on the racial inequities that exist and continue to permeate in our society. And those discussions, of course, remain ongoing, remain important. And as Kathy correctly mentions, it expands to many different initiatives, but certainly don't want to underscore the importance of dealing with the racial inequities in the workplace. And so, as I say, I welcome the opportunity and thank RESCON for returning to the topic, as it does continue to reveal itself in the workplaces and does require a discussion and a response. I'm mindful, of course, that we had talked about this topic in 2020, so I do hope to touch on, revisit some of the important elements that we dealt with, but also expand upon some of the decisions that have come up since then. As Kathy and Andrew were talking, I was nodding my head in agreement as far as not taking an increase in reports or complaints or claims as a negative, taking it as a positive in the sense that there's a reporting procedure, whether formally or informally, things are being brought to the attention. But that doesn't stop there, right? We do have obligations in responding to those reports. We have obligations in responding to situations, even if not being reported. And so I am going to talk about employers' legal obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as Meredith had alluded to earlier in the Best Practices Guide. I'll talk briefly about what to do when we receive a report of racial discrimination or harassment in the workplace. But I really want to focus on the latter portion, which is some recent examples, some recent decisions, because with the increased number of reports, claims, etc., we have seen grievances. We have seen applications with the Human Rights Tribunal that have resulted in public decisions. And I should say that at the outset, when an arbitrator or a vice chair at the Human Rights Tribunal makes a decision, that is public, and there are a great deal of detail that's involved as far as who said what by name, what happened on site, who it was reported to, which supervisors were involved by name, and what supervisors did or did not do in response to those reports. And then, of course, the arbitrator or vice chair then having to decide what to make of the situation. So something worth identifying at the outset. I'll start with the legal obligations. I do have some slides, but I want to first say at the outset, because I know this is a question that came up when it comes to our legal obligations. We've been asked before, you're going to hear me talking about human rights applications. You're going to hear me talking about grievances, as well as the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And a question that comes up is, can someone file both an application with the Human Rights Tribunal and a grievance with their union? And the answer when it comes to a member represented by the union is yes. An individual who's represented by the union can have a grievance filed, and that's heard by an arbitrator or the Ontario Labour Relations Board, an arbitrator with the Labour Relations Board, or that individual can decide to file an application with the Human Rights Tribunal. Now, to what extent both can consider the allegations at the same time, that's limited. Okay, so the tribunal does consider dismissing an application if, for example, the Labor Relations Board has already dealt with the allegations. But the tribunal will look at it and say, okay, has this person's allegations been appropriately dealt with in the grievance proceeding? So you may have a scenario, for example, where let's say the union files a grievance and there's an investigation, there's a discussion, the union withdraws the grievance. It's possible that that individual files an application with the Human Rights Tribunal if they aren't satisfied. Now, of course, when we are dealing with this type of scenario, and let's say council's involved or you have the relevant parties involved, we're always mindful of that. So I don't want to suggest that you're going to have to deal with both of them, but it is something to be aware of, that there isn't, a necessarily closed door to going to both tribunals. And then, of course, lurking in the background is the Ministry of Labor and the powers that it has under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And the workplace violence and harassment obligations under OSHA, Green Book, as many of us know it, are not limited to what I'm going to call the prohibited grounds under the code. Okay, so they don't have to demonstrate race, ethnic origin, nationality, but at the same time, if it's closely tied, obviously that will come up. But that's the other lingering presence that we have to be aware of when dealing with these type of complaints. So without further ado, I will get into my slide deck, mainly because I do want to highlight at this point. So I'm now talking about the Human Rights Code, and many of us know this already, so I'll quickly skim through it. But the code prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of certain prohibited grounds. And when we talk about racial discrimination, there's, of course, race, but that's not all. Okay, there are a number of grounds that the code touches upon, like ancestry, like place of origin, like ethnic origin, their citizenship, their color, and their creed. All of those are protected grounds. And so very often when we're dealing with one of these complaints or reports, you're hitting on not just their race, but where they came from, where they were born, their citizenship status, the color of their skin, the creed that they practice. These are all different areas that are covered by the code. And when we talk about the code's requirements on the basis of those protected grounds, employers are obligated, I put it into 4 general categories. Employers are obligated to obviously refrain from discriminatory practices. I would say that that's the more obvious obligation, and dealing with, blatant or obvious forms of racism. There's the requirement to accommodate a person to the point of undue hardship, which is what we typically see in cases of disability. There's also, and this I say is the key one when dealing with racial discrimination, providing a workplace or an environment free of harassment. And this one is the most challenging and tricky, and I would say difficult one to eliminate, which we'll talk about when we look at what constitutes a poisoned work environment on the basis of race or some of the other protected grounds. And then the last one is we can't reprise against an employee who exercises their rights under the code. One thing I do want to raise at this point, because it comes up, is employers will sometimes ask, well, it was one employee to another. It wasn't a supervisor, it wasn't a manager. And I think it's worth highlighting at this point that an employer under the code can be responsible for the actions of other employees. So what I mean by that is we can be vicariously liable for the actions done by another if it was done in the course of an employee's employment. So that includes, foremen, that includes supervisors, that includes health and safety reps. It's not enough to say it was this person who either ignored the report, it was this person who said what they said or did what they did. The code does, in some cases, dictate that the employer could be responsible for those actions. And then, of course, if we allow what's called a poisoned work environment on the basis of the prohibited grounds, then the employer can be responsible for that in its own right. One question that comes up is the union's role when we're dealing with, say, an employee saying something toward another employee, even the employee of a sub-trade saying something to one of our employees. Because of course, as speaking specifically about builders for a moment, we may have, say, one or two laborers on site, and then the others are employees of sub-trades. And so, and then if there's a group of laborers or a crew working together, what happens there? And the union is not, liable for the actions of others, but they too have their own obligations under the Human Rights Code. And so what you see is the unions, and quite rightly, police or enforce allegations or reports of discrimination, put the employer to task as far as investigating. The reality is there are complications. It can become difficult when it's one bargaining unit member against another bargaining unit member. And what we see there, and there's nothing inconsistent with this, is that the union may file a grievance on behalf of the member who is reporting racial discrimination on the workplace if they believe that there's a poisoned work environment. Often participate in the investigation to ensure that the members are given are afforded their rights during the investigation. And then if there's discipline, may very well file a grievance on behalf of the member or members who are disciplined. That does happen. There's nothing inconsistent with that, just given their obligations to represent their members as well as to enforce the collective agreement consistent with the code. But when that happens, when we're dealing with a bargaining unit member with another bargaining unit member, it just emphasizes the importance of involving the union business reps to inform them of what has happened, what are the steps that are being taken to investigate and to come to the conclusion that it did. That you do. As Andrew says, there is language in some collective agreements dealing with maintaining a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace, and that will only continue to grow. And so unions certainly increasingly have an interest. I shouldn't say increasingly. Unions certainly have an interest in this area. And are, increasingly involved in the investigation process at the outset, as opposed to, only knowing about the results of the investigation. There is a greater dialogue that's happening between all those who are involved in ensuring that the relevant stakeholders are both involved in the procedure, but also understand what led to the ultimate conclusion. When it comes to what constitutes racial discrimination, oftentimes I think, and I think many of us know this, and certainly we talked about this in 2020. Um, but we're increasingly becoming aware and sensitive to the fact that our intention does not matter. Okay, so whether we, make an inappropriate joke or an inappropriate comment, or we are asking inappropriate questions, the answer, well, I didn't mean to offend the person. I didn't mean to, I'm not racist, or I'm not talking about it in a bad way. That's besides the point. It's actually misses the point entirely. The idea with racial discrimination is the effect that it has, and as well as the acknowledgement that there may be some implicit bias. And so when we flip that definition and put it in its proper context as far as what is considered and what isn't, then hopefully that identifies the need to respond to reports. For example, sometimes somebody will make a comment that is contributes to someone's sense of a poisoned work environment, and the supervisor will speak to the crew member and say, so and so said this. What did you mean by that? And the supervisor, oh, I didn't mean it. I was just, upset. I had this going on. I wasn't really paying attention, and then leave it at that. Because they figure, well, they didn't mean to offend anyone's feelings. I do want to divorce ourselves from the view that intent is what dictates whether or not it was racial discrimination. I do want to highlight that the code also protects harassment. Harassment meaning a course of conduct that is vexatious is the technical term. I'll say inappropriate or offensive. That's known or ought reasonably to be known as unwelcome. This is the same definition across the code as well as the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The difference being the code protects it on prohibited grounds, whereas the Act does not limit it to prohibited grounds. So I've included, and this came up the last presentation, some forms of discrimination, harassment, stereotyping, assuming something to be true simply because of the person's ethnic origin, racial profiling, of course, the slurs, the jokes, the name calling, the nicknames, cartoons, or, circulating images or memes or GIFs or whatever acronym that we come up with next. And even if, like, okay, whether someone's laughed doesn't matter, whether somebody didn't object to it doesn't matter. I mean, there are certain standards by which we have to meet, and slurs, jokes, name calling, nicknames are just are viewed as unacceptable in the workplace, despite that being maybe the case or the culture for a number of years. This came up a little bit earlier as far as the required policies. So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, many of us will know that we are required to have workplace violence policies and procedures, as well as workplace harassment policy and procedures. Those are required to be reviewed annually and have been a requirement for, since 2010. So 14 years, I'm sure many of us are familiar of it. The code, the Human Rights Code, does not technically require under the code a anti-discrimination policy, but as you're probably not surprised by, strongly recommended. We had circulated a draft policy in 2020 dealing with the code obligations and discrimination. And some of the important things, I mean, obvious, many employers will have a discrimination, violence, and harassment policy, which is fine. I think increasing number of employers are separating the two, discrimination as one and violence and harassment as the other. And what we really want that policy to cover is, one, of course, setting the tone. We are responsible for the workplace. We have not only the ultimate responsibility, but a great role in setting the tone for the workplace as far as what is respectful behavior versus not. But it also sets out very important key elements like who are you reporting it to? Who will conduct the investigation? What could the investigation look like? And what violations of the policy could result in? For example, if you are found to have violated this policy, you may be disciplined up to and including termination for cause. That's something that you want to have in a discrimination policy. It sets the tone, but also makes the expectations as well as the consequences very clear if somebody were to engage in a racist act in the course of their employment. I also included, our obligations under OSHA, but as I say, many of us are fully aware of it and have been working with it for a very long time. So I don't want to repeat what we may already know on that. But of course, being mindful, as I say, that there is that lingering presence of the Ministry of Labor, as well, having, we may see, and I see it either as a first instance or a last instance. It's sort of sometimes the first place people go, is calling the Ministry of Labor, is also sometimes when nothing else is working or when no one is responding, the last place that they'll go to have somebody attend the work site. And then, of course, the inspector will show up and ask whether there's been an investigation, whether the investigation has started, whether it's been an external third party who's been appointed as the investigator, whether you're within the 90 days or another reasonable time period. There are questions that the inspector will come armed with to ask if there is that report that comes in. If there is that report, I'll tell you how to investigate these types of reports can have a seminar all on its own. But we do have a duty to investigate in 3 key scenarios. If an employee brings a complaint, if alleging there's a violation of the human rights, number 1, number 2, violence or harassment, or number 3, a policy or collective agreement. And so when there is a report of those 3, then that may very well trigger your duty to investigate. And you'll see in some of the decisions that I'm going to talk about very shortly, that is an important element. Because if you do not investigate and there is a claim of racial discrimination later down the road, you're going to be really flat-footed in your ability to demonstrate what happened, who said what, how it was taken care of, and it's not viewed favorably by adjudicators. As I say, this all can be expanded on, but I'm appreciative of time. We are required to conduct an investigation that's, quote, appropriate in the circumstances. What that entails, whether a sort of step aside, who said what, and what are we dealing with, whether that type of informal discussion is sufficient versus needing to bring in an external third party does, unfortunately, I'm not able to give sort of here's your bright line test. It does depend on the circumstances when you're able to deal with it on a sort of impromptu, informal basis versus requiring legally to retain an investigator or appoint an investigator to look into the allegations. Interview the individuals, assess the evidence, make conclusions, and then report the findings. There are times where supervisors, managers, health and safety reps will investigate, will complete the process, but not report the findings to what I'll call the complainant, the person who's making the report, as well as the person who was being complained of. And that is both a requirement under OSHA, also could lead to liability under the Human Rights Code, so is something we certainly want to be doing. But okay, I want to talk very briefly about some of the decisions that have come up. You'll see these decisions arose in 2021 to 2023. And do warrant specific sort of attention when dealing with these cases. So the first one I have, the employer CTS, working at the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project. The griever was a Black man who was employed as a laborer born in St. Vincent. And he had reported to his supervisors at various times that there was either comments made by other laborers or crew members on site. There was some suggestion that if something went missing, like a tool or a hard hat, that the BIPOC members of the workplace would be questioned about it, but not necessarily the others. But the two main incidences that were being considered was he had purchased some tools, or had the company purchase some tools. He stored it in his toolbox, and then when he went on vacation, he went to visit St. Vincent. His toolbox was cut open without explanation, and he had failed to respond to his radio during an assignment, and so the supervisor was not happy about him not responding to the radio. And in both incidences, when he returned and saw his toolbox was cut open, as well as when he was spoken to about not responding to his radio, he became angry and agitated, and he raised his voice. And the supervisors met with him and issued a written warning. And that written warning wasn't grieved, but following that, the employer then terminated his employment for cause, given his, the outbursts, the angry outbursts that he had while on site. And the griever then, of course, grieved that his termination was without just cause, but also that it was racially motivated. And the board agreed. The labor board found that they didn't have just cause, and that the termination was tainted based on race. And in doing so, the board, said, look, racial stereotyping doesn't announce itself loudly, clearly, or unapologetically. It found that the griever was subjected to a more nuanced form of discrimination, in that they viewed his outbursts perhaps to be more intimidating because of his ethnic origin or being from St. Vincent. And the key is that the board found the employer did little to investigate his complaints, that the incidences, mainly the cutting of his toolbox, the reaction about him not responding on the radio, and the ignoring of some of the other things that he brought, were racially motivated, and the employer did nothing with that information. And so the board questioned that outright. Why did the company do little to investigate the claims that there were racially motivated events that were happening on site, and consider that that wasn't given its due credit, and found that the termination was in part tainted with racial bias? The one other decision, and I'm going to just speed through some of it just given timing, but the one other decision that I wanted to highlight is a human rights application that was brought by a subcontractor. Okay, so we're talking about an independent sub who worked for a company that did residential landscaping. And that sub called the respondent, the residential landscaping business, and wanted to be paid. There were some outstanding invoices. And the respondent, responded by saying, we're not paying you, et cetera, and insulted him and called him racial slurs during the conversation, and threatened to call the police. And so that sub, not, of course, not being able to bring a grievance because he's not an employee of the unionized employee, did bring an application before the Human Rights Tribunal. And that can be done. We can face applications under the Human Rights Code under contracts by a subcontractor. And the Human Rights Tribunal found that the respondents did commit acts of discrimination, the content of the conversation, including some of which were in texts, found that the acts were demeaning, were dehumanizing, and perpetuated negative stereotypes of young Black men as criminals. And so the subcontractor was awarded $7,500 in damages. The next case I want to talk about is, when we're dealing with reprisal. So in this case, the griever was assigned to work on a crew and got into an argument with another crew member. And that crew member, who happened to be the son of the foreman, called the griever a racial slur. And the foreman, the father, didn't do anything at the time. And another foreman asked the griever after the argument if he was going to, quote, freak out again, and was moved to a different crew. And in working with that different crew, was asked to get a broom where he would run into that original crew member who called him the racial slur. And a couple of things is that the arbitrator found that that single slur, saying the racial slur that one time, was enough, was egregious enough, and a standalone incident to constitute a poisoned work environment. So it's important to remember we're not it doesn't necessarily need to be repeated events. One of these racial slurs is certainly enough to create a poisoned work environment, which I don't think should be a surprise to any of us. And the case also found that there was essentially no investigation into what happened. And the employer was required to pay $15,000 in damages. But also, the arbitrator also considered that he was reprised against, in the sense that he was the subject of a racial slur. He was moved to a different crew, and then as part of that crew was required to run into this crew member. And I raise it because I think it highlights the importance of conducting an investigation. Again, to what extent that investigation looks like is always depending on what happened. But not conducting that investigation really affects your ability to justify the actions that follow. It could quite possibly be that if there was a report of racial discrimination, it is appropriate to separate the individuals, to figure out while the investigation is going on whether the continued working relationship or having the day-to-day interactions is tenable. It's quite possible that that's the case. But the key is that you're investigating. If you don't investigate or complete an investigation, communicate those results, then, as I say, you really flat-foot yourself as far as being able to justify the actions that follow. And then the final decision I'll included is this is the same one. My apologies. The one thing that came up is, oh no, we're talking about a different one. There's one decision that resulted in a layoff. So essentially, an individual was the only Black laborer on site, and there were continuous comments about his color, the way that he spoke, the things that he would post in the lunchroom. And he reported those issues and was then later laid off on the basis of shortage of work. And I include this because, a question that comes up is, if somebody brings a report, can they be laid off due to shortage of work? And this case was dealing with that issue because the griever was laid off due to the shortage of work, and there was a witness that testified that this was due to poor performance. And the arbitrator found that this individual was discriminated against. There were the comments, there were the jokes, there was things that he would say being posted in the lunchroom. But again, if you're noticing the theme, it's intentional. The employer failed to recognize those incidents, to stop them, to investigate, or to address them. And so when it then came time to lay him off due to the shortage of work, the arbitrator considered that that was tainted by discrimination. And I included a key quote from the decision where the arbitrator said that the layoff was a convenient way of making the problem disappear. And the problem was the continued poison to work environment, all in the context of a layoff on account of, an alleged shortage of work. But the arbitrator, because there was no investigation, because there was no response, there was no attempt to address the incidences that no one disputed occurred, there was, as I say, a real challenge to all of the events that followed afterward, and trying to dispel the, what ultimately becomes the finding that it was tainted by racial discrimination or the reports that were being made by the individual. So I raised those decisions, and as I say, the theme is intentional. And this touches on something earlier that, can't remember if it was Kathy or Andrew was saying, you have to be aware of the problem and you have to actively investigate when you have these reports or when you are aware of a culture or environment of these jokes, of these comments, to deal with the issue. We are well beyond the point where we can turn a blind eye to the incidences. We very much do have to investigate. And the reality is, especially if you don't, even if you do, but especially if you don't, the actions that follow will absolutely be viewed under the lens of that failure to investigate or that failure to address the incidences. So I appreciate I'm slightly over time and I'm not sure if there's any questions, so I apologize for maybe not getting to them, but I did hope to address some of the common ones that come up through the course of it.
Thank you so much, Diane, for that wonderful presentation. The real life examples of more recent cases are definitely a big help to everyone attending. I unfortunately don't think we have time for questions, but I do think you covered a lot, so there weren't many questions coming through, so thanks again. I'm just going to quickly move into closing remarks. Thanks again to all of our amazing speakers and all those that attended. We hope this discussion today, as well as the launch of our best practice guide, has provided valuable resources for individuals in the construction industry to use going forward. Just take some time to reflect on the information provided and determine where your company is at with their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or Andrew if you need help going forward. The post-event summary will include a link to the recording as well as the best practice guide. This will also be found on our website. Thanks again, and we look forward to continuing the discussion around DE&I in the construction industry.